Imagine pressing your face to a cold train window, leaving behind the scorching sands of North Africa, and expecting to see a land in ruins, a nation hollowed out by war, weakened by chaos, and teetering on the edge of collapse. This was the vision German soldiers carried with them. Fed by years of relentless propaganda, they had been told that America was decadent, disorganized, and ripe for defeat. Every poster, every broadcast, every whispered rumor reinforced the idea that the enemy was failing, fragile, and soon to crumble under the weight of its own freedom. But as the train rolled across the vast American landscape in 1943, that narrative began to unravel. Instead of bombed-out cities or ration lines, the soldiers' eyes were met with endless green fields, well-kept towns, and farms that seemed to stretch without end. The air was clean, the towns orderly, and the pace of life unhurried yet productive. Every passing scene was a direct contradiction to what they had been taught to believe. Young men like 19-year-old Klaus Bernhard were left bewildered, questioning the very foundation of their understanding. Could this be the same America their leaders had painted as weak and decadent? The first shock came not from grandeur or spectacle, but from something far more immediate: food. After months of dwindling rations and meager meals on the front lines, German POWs were introduced to an array of fresh meat, vegetables, and bread, simple, ordinary staples, yet luxuries they had almost forgotten existed. This was not a one-time display for visitors. It was everyday life. The abundance was disarming, almost unbelievable, and it quietly began to plant the seeds of doubt about the stories they had been told. But the surprise did not stop at material wealth. The soldiers were quickly confronted with the unfamiliar rhythms of American society. Women moved confidently through professional roles, managing camps, giving instructions, and caring for the sick. This was a world where authority and competence were not defined by gender, where fairness and respect shaped interactions, and where hierarchy did not dominate every aspect of daily life. For men indoctrinated with rigid notions of obedience and superiority, it was both confusing and fascinating. As the POWs settled into camp life, a slow transformation began. Clean barracks, recreation fields, and libraries offered not just comfort, but a chance to observe a society organized on principles of fairness and efficiency rather than fear. Daily routines, work assignments on farms, and educational opportunities provided an informal yet profound lesson in human dignity, cooperation, and democratic values. Every meal shared, every conversation had, and every small act of respect chipped away at the rigid worldview they had carried into captivity. This story is not just about war or surrender, it is about the power of exposure, curiosity, and compassion to challenge even the most deeply ingrained beliefs. And as we explore the journey of these German POWs through America's heartland, you will see how a simple act of humanity, combined with opportunity and respect, can transform lives in ways history rarely records. If you are fascinated by history, human resilience, and the surprising lessons of World War II, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the rest of this incredible story. The surrender of the Afrika Korps in May 1943 marked a pivotal moment, not only for the course of World War II, but also for the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, who suddenly themselves in a world they could never have imagined. Over 400,000 German soldiers, weary from months of harsh desert campaigns and battle-hardened by the relentless pressures of war, were transported across the Atlantic to American soil, an audacious solution that both confounded the public and reshaped the experience of captivity for the prisoners themselves. For the American citizens of the towns near the incoming camps, the announcement was almost unbelievable. The notion that thousands of enemy soldiers, the very embodiment of the Reich's military machine, would soon be living in their communities provoked a mixture of fear, curiosity, and skepticism, yet it was a calculated necessity. Britain, struggling under the strain of its own war effort and facing overcrowded facilities, could not accommodate such a vast influx of prisoners without diverting critical resources from the front lines. And so the United States, with its geographic expanse and relative security from direct invasion, became the unlikely custodian of a captive army. For the German soldiers themselves, the journey across the Atlantic was disorienting in more ways than one. After months of enduring the unforgiving heat of North Africa, the cramped transport ships, and the constant threat of enemy attack, they were now faced with an environment that challenged their very understanding of what captivity, or indeed, what life itself could entail. They had been trained to expect cruelty, deprivation, and rigid control. Yet from the moment they stepped off the ships at ports such as Norfolk and New York, it became apparent that these expectations were about to be thoroughly upended. The meticulous organization, the clean uniforms of their American guards, and the calm, professional demeanor of the port authorities created a quiet dissonance. A subtle but powerful suggestion that perhaps the world they had known was not the only reality. The journey inland to the camps only deepened this sense of incredulity, as train cars carried them across rolling fields and small towns. The soldiers were confronted with an abundance of visual evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. Farmhouses were well kept, children played in open yards, and towns bustled with commerce and life that seemed untouched by the destruction of war. Every passing scene, every unbroken line of trees, every orderly street contributed to the slow, unsettling realization that the propaganda that had painted America as decadent, weak, and ready to collapse was a lie, meticulously constructed to manipulate and control. This realization was not simply intellectual. It was deeply emotional, causing soldiers to wrestle with confusion, curiosity, and a hesitant admiration for the very people they had been trained to despise. Once they arrived at the camps, the contrast between expectation and reality became even more pronounced. The facilities were designed in accordance with the Geneva Convention, yet they went beyond mere compliance to provide a humane and structured environment. Heated barracks, organized dining halls, recreation fields, and libraries created a setting that was orderly yet comfortable, offering prisoners the rare opportunity to recover, reflect, and even learn. For many of these young men, it was the first time in years that they could contemplate life without the immediate pressures of survival, a revelation that forced them to reconsider the definitions of power, civility, and human dignity. The American approach to captivity, while firm in enforcing rules, eschewed cruelty in favor of respect and structure, demonstrating a surprising level of confidence in both their own values and the capacity of the prisoners to respond to fair treatment. The cultural shock extended beyond material comfort into the very fabric of society. Soldiers who had been immersed in the rigid, patriarchal, and hierarchical world of Nazi Germany were confronted with a society in which women exercised authority, competence, and independence across professional domains. Nurses, administrators, and even some supervisory roles in the camps were held by women who commanded respect not through fear but through skill and presence, undermining long-held notions of gender roles that had been propagated as immutable truths. Prisoners observed farm owners working side by side with employees, supervisors treating laborers with dignity regardless of status, and communities operating with a sense of casual egalitarianism that directly contradicted the structured hierarchy of the homeland they had left behind. Each interaction, each demonstration of fairness, and each small act of mutual respect quietly chipped away at the rigid worldview that had been instilled in them from youth. Work assignments on farms and in industries, mandated under the Geneva Convention, became an unexpected avenue for education and reflection. Tasks that might have seemed humiliating were reframed by the conditions in which they were performed, conditions that emphasized respect, fair treatment, and the shared goal of productivity. Soldiers like Otto Richter, working on Nebraska farms, witnessed firsthand the human capacity for decency, empathy, and cooperation, even when applied to the supposed enemy. The men were not only contributing to the broader war effort, but they were also absorbing lessons in civic responsibility, personal dignity, and the meaning of a society organized around principles other than fear, obedience, and coercion. At the same time, educational programs within the camps offered intellectual stimulation and exposure to new ideas. English lessons, access to newspapers, and discussion groups facilitated by American educators and chaplains allowed prisoners to engage with concepts of democracy, critical thinking, and personal responsibility. They were encouraged to question, to debate, and to examine historical evidence for themselves, a stark departure from the monolithic indoctrination they had received in Germany. Through these experiences, the men began to develop a nuanced understanding of freedom, ethics, and the responsibilities of citizenship, laying the groundwork for moral reflection and personal growth that would continue long after their repatriation. The arrival of over 400,000 German soldiers on American soil was more than a logistical challenge. It became a profound experiment in human behavior, cultural exchange, and moral transformation. The unexpected prosperity, humane treatment, and social structure of the United States challenged the very assumptions that had sustained the Nazi worldview, forcing prisoners to reconcile their past beliefs with the reality they now faced. The audacity of transporting such a vast number of enemy soldiers into the heartland, combined with a steadfast commitment to fairness and respect, created conditions for reflection, education, and ultimately transformation, proof that even in the context of war, the principles of dignity, civility, and empathy could become instruments of lasting change. Upon arriving at the American camps, the German prisoners were confronted with a reality that was as bewildering as it was transformative. A reality that stood in stark contrast to everything they had been taught to expect. Years of indoctrination had convinced them that the enemy lived in chaos, that civilians starved while soldiers fought in misery, and that the institutions of the United States were fragile, corrupt, and decadent. Yet the camps they now entered were designed with meticulous care, adhering rigorously to the principles of the Geneva Convention. And in doing so, they exposed the prisoners to a model of order, fairness, and human dignity that was entirely foreign to them. Clean, heated barracks replaced the imagined squalor. Orderly dining halls offered nutritious meals that were both abundant and consistently prepared. Libraries stocked with books and magazines opened new windows to knowledge, debate, and perspectives beyond their previous experience, while recreation fields provided space for physical activity, relaxation, and the subtle but profound affirmation that life could exist without constant fear or brutality. The very structure of the camps communicated a quiet, almost imperceptible message that a society could be strong and secure without resorting to cruelty or oppression, that discipline and compassion were not mutually exclusive, and that human beings could be trusted to respond to fair treatment with cooperation rather than rebellion. For soldiers accustomed to the harsh discipline and frequent brutality of the front lines, this environment was at first disorienting. Many had assumed that captivity would be a continuation of the violence and deprivation they had known in North Africa and on the Eastern Front, where ration lines, corporal punishment, and arbitrary cruelty were common. Instead, the American approach was rooted in consistency, predictability, and respect for human dignity. Meals were served on time, facilities were maintained, and routines were structured not to humiliate but to sustain and educate. The prisoners could not help but notice that this method of governance relied not on fear, intimidation, or propaganda, but on the implicit understanding that individuals, even those who had been trained to be enemies, could respond responsibly when treated as capable, thinking human beings. Every detail of camp life, from the precise scheduling of chores to the respectful interactions with guards, acted as a subtle yet powerful contradiction to the rigidly hierarchical and often brutal society that had shaped the prisoners' upbringing in Germany. The psychological impact of this environment was compounded by the sheer material comfort that contrasted so starkly with life in the war zones they had left behind. Simple things, such as a warm meal of fresh meat and vegetables, soft bread, or a clean bed, became moments of revelation, forcing the prisoners to reassess what was possible in a society governed by democratic principles and ethical standards. The abundance they encountered was not ostentatious but ordinary, a reflection of a system that valued the well-being of individuals rather than seeking to impress through extravagance. This abundance was accompanied by access to knowledge. Libraries provided reading material that ranged from literature and history to newspapers reporting current events, offering insights into the complexities of American society, politics, and culture. For the first time, the prisoners encountered a society in which information was freely available, discussion was encouraged, and ideas could be debated openly, a sharp departure from the tightly controlled and propagandized media of Nazi Germany. The simple act of reading a newspaper or borrowing a book became an intellectual awakening, revealing that the enemy they had been trained to hate possessed a depth, resilience, and humanity they had never imagined. Recreation and physical activity were also integral to this holistic approach to captivity, offering both respite and subtle education. Sports, games, and organized leisure activities provided prisoners with a sense of community and cooperation, demonstrating principles of fairness, teamwork, and mutual respect. These activities, seemingly ordinary, held profound significance. They illustrated that order and civility could emerge naturally from structured, equitable conditions rather than through caution or fear. In participating, the prisoners were learning lessons about leadership, responsibility, and interpersonal dynamics that were entirely absent from their previous experiences under authoritarian command. Even the guards, while maintaining authority, conducted themselves with professionalism, reinforcing a model of discipline rooted in respect rather than intimidation. Perhaps most striking was how this environment challenged the prisoners' deepest beliefs about the nature of power, authority, and societal organization. In Germany, hierarchy was rigid, obedience was demanded, and deviation from prescribed roles was met with suspicion or punishment. Here, they witnessed a system in which rules existed to ensure fairness and efficiency, not to enforce domination, and where the welfare of each individual was taken into account as a matter of principle rather than convenience. This exposure initiated a profound internal questioning. If a nation could maintain order, security, and productivity while treating its inhabitants and even its captives with dignity, what did that say about the myths of weakness, decadence, and moral inferiority that had been drilled into them for years? The clean barracks, the regular meals, the access to books and recreation, and the respectful interactions with American personnel slowly eroded the rigid worldview imposed upon them. planting seeds of reflection that would grow in unexpected ways over the months of captivity. Through the simple, consistent application of human treatment, the American camps became more than places of confinement. They were living lessons in ethical governance, societal organization, and the capacity for human decency. Every element, from infrastructure to daily routine, worked in concert to reveal the principles of fairness, respect, and personal responsibility. In the quiet, measured rhythm of camp life, the prisoners began to recognize a truth that was almost revolutionary in its subtlety. Strength did not require cruelty, authority did not require fear, and a society could be secure, productive, and morally sound at the same time. In this way, the camps not only defied Nazi propaganda, but also initiated a process of intellectual and moral awakening, demonstrating that exposure to humane and principled systems could profoundly reshape beliefs, attitudes, and the very understanding of what it meant to live in a society guided by justice, dignity, and mutual respect. As the German prisoners settled into the rhythm of camp life, absorbing the shocks of abundance, education, and unexpected freedom, another layer of astonishment began to take hold, one that challenged not only their assumptions about power and society, but also the very foundations of their worldview. The presence and authority of American women, conditioned by years of Nazi indoctrination. They had been taught that a woman's place was strictly confined to the domestic sphere, defined by the home, the church, and unquestioning service to male authority. Women were to be nurturers, caregivers, and passive observers of public life, their influence limited and their capabilities circumscribed by ideology that equated deviation with weakness or moral decay. Yet within the confines of the camps, these soldiers found themselves confronted with a reality that defied every expectation, a society in which women wielded authority, commanded respect, and executed responsibilities with competence and confidence that left the prisoners both perplexed and fascinated. Lieutenant Vera Hoffman, captured during the Tunisia campaign, recorded his first encounter with a female American nurse in his diary. He described the scene in vivid detail, a woman issuing orders with clarity and assurance, attending to both prisoners and guards, her presence unquestioned and her instructions followed without hesitation. In the rigidly patriarchal world of Germany, such a display would have been considered unnatural, perhaps even scandalous. Yet here it was ordinary, expected, and efficient. Hoffman's surprise was echoed by countless others who observed female staff not only in healthcare but also in administration, education, and in some cases supervisory positions within the camp structure itself. These women were not merely performing duties. They were embodying a cultural ethos in which competence, responsibility, and authority were recognized and respected regardless of gender, presenting a living challenge to the prisoners' deeply ingrained beliefs about societal hierarchy. The reactions of the POWs were complex and revealing. Some responded with bewilderment, their mental frameworks strained to accommodate this apparent anomaly. Others approached it with curiosity, observing, questioning, and slowly absorbing the implications. What did it mean? They wondered. For a society to function effectively when women held authority and were treated as equals in professional settings, how could a system survive, let alone thrive, when it appeared to contradict the supposedly natural order they had been taught to revere? Every encounter, from the orderly administration of camp routines to the measured authority of a female supervisor overseeing work assignments or educational programs, forced the prisoners to reconsider not just the capabilities of women, but the validity of the rigid social hierarchies that had dominated their upbringing. This cultural exposure extended beyond mere observation. In classrooms and workshops, female instructors led lessons with clarity and authority, teaching English, vocational skills, and civic principles, guiding prisoners through exercises in critical thinking and problem-solving. In these settings, gender was irrelevant. Competence was paramount. Prisoners learned to respect instruction based on merit rather than social position or conformity to traditional gender norms. Outside the classroom, on farms and in industrial work programs, female supervisors managed teams, resolved disputes, and coordinated efforts with skill that highlighted the effectiveness of egalitarian principles in action. The prisoners witnessed a society in which mutual respect and professionalism, rather than rigid hierarchy and intimidation, structured daily life. The cumulative impact of these experiences was profound. For young men who had been immersed in doctrines of absolute obedience and patriarchal authority, seeing women exercise control with confidence and fairness undermined assumptions that had seemed unshakable. The revelation was not merely intellectual. It was deeply psychological, forcing a confrontation with the limits of the ideology they had internalized. If a society could function efficiently, productively, and even compassionately while allowing women to occupy positions of authority, then the core arguments of Nazi social doctrine appeared increasingly hollow. What had been presented as immutable natural law, the subordination of women, the rigid hierarchy of gender and class, was now shown to be a cultural construct, one that could be reimagined, challenged, and restructured without societal collapse. This confrontation with gender norms also intersected with broader observations about the character of American society. Prisoners saw a world in which fairness, opportunity, and dignity were not the exclusive preserve of men, where cooperation and shared responsibility were valued, and where the strength of a community derived from the participation of all its members, regardless of gender. As they worked alongside these women, listened to their instruction, and observed their influence, the prisoners were gradually introduced to a concept that had been absent from their own society. That authority and respect were earned through competence and character, not simply inherited, assigned, or enforced through fear. The shock of encountering this principle in practice provoked reflection, debate, and, in some cases, a quiet admiration that would not have been conceivable before their arrival. Over time, these encounters contributed to a broader revaluation of the social and moral assumptions that had defined the prisoners' worldview. If one aspect of society, the role of women, could so clearly contradict Nazi doctrine without causing societal collapse, what else about the beliefs and propaganda they had been taught might be false or misleading? The authority exercised by American women served not merely as a curiosity or an oddity. It became a lens through which the prisoners began to question hierarchy, obedience, and the very nature of social organization. It was an entry point into critical thinking, a subtle but powerful challenge to unquestioned dogma, and a revelation that would shape their intellectual and moral development throughout captivity and beyond. In witnessing the competence, authority, and independence of American women, German POWs were confronted with a cultural reality that was not only unfamiliar but transformative. It challenged their assumptions, reshaped their understanding of social power, and provided an early lesson in the broader principles of equality, fairness, and human dignity that underpinned the society around them. The shock and awe they experienced in these encounters were not fleeting. They were the beginning of a slow, penetrating process of awareness and moral reconsideration that would echo long after the war, illustrating how exposure to new perspectives can fundamentally reshape belief systems and reveal the possibilities of a more equitable and humane world. As the days stretched into weeks and months within the American camps, the German prisoners began to step beyond the boundaries of barracks and classrooms, venturing into the sprawling farms and bustling factories that formed the backbone of the nation's productive capacity. Initially, the prospect of labor seemed a continuation of captivity. a task imposed by their captors to extract work from those they had trained to see as enemies. Yet what awaited them in these fields and workshops was far from the harsh punishment or exploitative drudgery they had envisioned. Instead, they were immersed in environments that embodied principles both unfamiliar and, over time, profoundly instructive, exposing them to a model of labor that emphasized fairness, respect, and dignity, rather than hierarchy, coercion, or subjugation. On a sun-drenched morning in Nebraska, Otto Richter, an artillery sergeant recently assigned to a local farm, recorded his astonishment in a small diary he kept, noting the informal, collaborative nature of American work culture. He observed the farm owner, James O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had built his enterprise from scratch, moving among workers with a combination of authority and empathy that defied the rigid social stratification he had known in Germany. Unlike the inflexible divisions between laborer and officer, elite and peasant, that defined his homeland, here everyone's contribution was acknowledged, every effort noticed, and every individual treated as deserving of basic respect. When Richter approached a task, he was met not with suspicion or derision, but with guidance and encouragement. While O'Sullivan paused mid-afternoon to share a story about his son serving in the Pacific, expressing genuine empathy for the hardships of a distant battlefield. The exchange, marked by mutual recognition of shared humanity rather than rigid social roles, left Richter both unsettled and enlightened, challenging him to reconsider the assumptions about authority and hierarchy that had dominated his life. In the factories, a similar pattern unfolded, where German POWs found themselves contributing to production lines under supervision that combined efficiency with civility. Foremen and managers, many of whom had risen through the ranks from laborers themselves, treated the prisoners as partners in achieving common goals, rather than as subordinates to be commanded or controlled. Instructions were precise but delivered respectfully, and mistakes were corrected with patience rather than punishment. Over time, the prisoners recognized that the system did not rely on fear to enforce compliance. It relied on trust, accountability, and the acknowledgement that each worker, regardless of origin or prior status, had the capacity to contribute meaningfully. For men trained to accept a worldview in which social position determined both opportunity and respect, the contrast was striking and often disorienting. Beyond the mechanics of labor, the interactions themselves offered lessons in empathy, fairness, and the dignity inherent in honest work. Prisoners witnessed Americans performing menial tasks alongside employees, sharing tools, water, and advice without regard to their own status. The principles of reciprocity and respect extended even to prisoners of war, who were compensated for their labor in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Though modest, the pay was real, providing both a tangible reward and an affirmation of their status as human beings rather than mere instruments of war. These experiences offered a practical education that no classroom could replicate, showing that fairness and human dignity were not abstract ideals, but achievable realities within everyday life. This exposure also highlighted the limitations of Nazi ideology, which emphasized strict social hierarchy, inherited status, and the subordination of manual labor to intellectual or military pursuits. In Germany, a deep gulf separated the working class from officers, administrators, and elites. Labor was undervalued, and the individual was rarely recognized outside of the rigid framework imposed by the state. By contrast, the American model demonstrated that effort, skill, and initiative could confer respect regardless of birth or rank. Soldiers like Richter began to see that leadership was earned through competence and integrity, not merely inherited or enforced, and that a society could achieve efficiency, productivity, and cohesion without the dehumanizing hierarchies to which they had been accustomed. The subtleties of these lessons were reinforced by repeated experiences in varied settings. On farms, they learned the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and tending livestock, observing how cooperation and shared responsibility yielded results that individual effort alone could not achieve. In factories, they discovered that attention to detail, initiative, and mutual accountability were valued and rewarded, and that mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than occasions for humiliation. The prisoners saw firsthand how a system rooted in fairness and respect produced not only material efficiency, but also a sense of community, loyalty, and shared purpose. Moreover, these interactions offered insights into broader cultural values that extended far beyond labor. They observed a society in which authority was exercised with restraint, education was widely accessible, and personal responsibility was expected and nurtured rather than enforced through fear. The contrast with the rigid, authoritarian structures of Germany could not have been clearer. Whereas obedience in the Reich was demanded without question, here accountability was balanced with guidance, and compliance emerged naturally from understanding rather than coercion. Each day spent working alongside Americans, each small act of mutual respect, gradually eroded the assumptions about society, hierarchy, and human nature that had been inculcated through years of propaganda. As the weeks turned into months, these experiences took root in the consciousness of the prisoners, transforming their understanding of labor, authority, and social interaction. What had begun as enforced work became a profound, informal education in democratic principles, social equity, and the dignity of human effort. They witnessed a model of society where fairness and respect were not concessions but foundational values, where individual worth was measured by contribution and integrity rather than inherited status, and where cooperation could coexist with personal freedom. In this way, labor itself became a lens through which German POWs glimpsed a new vision of human potential and societal organization, one that would resonate long after their return home, quietly shaping their ideas about leadership, morality, and the possibility of a more equitable and humane world. As the German prisoners of war settled into their new routines, the camps evolved into more than just places of confinement. They became arenas of intellectual and moral awakening, challenging everything the men had been taught to believe about society, authority, and personal responsibility. The initial astonishment at abundance and fairness slowly gave way to opportunities for reflection, learning, and engagement that many had never imagined possible. Classrooms were established where prisoners could study English, not merely as a practical skill, but as a gateway to understanding a world far beyond the narrow, propagandized worldview they had been immersed in since youth. For soldiers who had been drilled in obedience and repetition, the idea of learning as a means of exploration and dialogue was revolutionary, offering a new lens through which to examine both their captors and themselves. In these lessons, the German men encountered language as a tool of empowerment rather than indoctrination, unlocking access to newspapers, magazines, and written materials that offered perspectives on governance, society, and the unfolding conflict that were starkly different from the rigid narratives they had grown up with. For the first time, they could read debates, editorials, and investigative reports that questioned policies, critique leaders, and celebrated the role of public opinion in shaping society. The controlled, monolithic news of Nazi Germany, where every article reinforced obedience and justified authoritarian rule, was replaced by a landscape of inquiry, dissent, and dialogue. Prisoners discovered that information could provoke thought rather than dictate it, and that disagreement was not treason but a sign of civic engagement and intellectual vitality. Alongside these linguistic and informational tools, the camps fostered opportunities for philosophical and moral exploration under the guidance of American chaplains. These discussions addressed subjects that had been distorted or suppressed under the Nazi regime, including individual conscience, moral accountability, and the capacity for personal redemption. Unlike the co-opted religious teachings they had received in Germany, which reinforced obedience to the state, these sessions encouraged reflection on ethical principles and the moral weight of one's choices. Prisoners were invited to consider questions that were deeply uncomfortable, yet profoundly necessary. What is the responsibility of an individual within a society? How does one distinguish right from wrong when obedience has been weaponized? And what role does empathy play in human relationships? These conversations, often held in small, attentive groups, became spaces where fear was replaced by inquiry, where rigid dogma was challenged, and where prisoners could begin to reconstruct a moral framework independent of authoritarian dictates. The process of education was reinforced through experiential learning, from engaging in structured work programs to participating in recreational and cultural activities. Prisoners learned to observe, analyze, and reflect not only on American society, but also on their own behaviors and assumptions. Discussions sparked by readings, classroom exercises, and exposure to a free press enabled the soldiers to draw connections between civic structures and personal responsibility, demonstrating how democratic principles functioned in everyday life. They witnessed systems where accountability was distributed, authority was earned rather than imposed, and citizens were empowered to question and influence governance. These were not abstract theories. They were principles lived and demonstrated daily by the very society in which the prisoners found themselves. The educational programs were designed not to indoctrinate, but to cultivate reasoning, curiosity, and moral awareness. Prisoners were encouraged to express their thoughts, to challenge assumptions, and to defend positions using evidence and analysis rather than rote repetition. The process of dialogue, critique, and debate was transformative, providing tools for critical thinking that many soldiers had never been permitted to exercise. Gustav Weber, a former panzer commander, recalled the first time he was asked for his personal opinion on democracy in a political science class. Conditioned to parrot ideology without reflection, he hesitated, offering the standard Nazi talking point that democracy would lead to chaos. Instead of reprimand or ridicule, the professor guided him through historical examples, encouraging Weber to assess evidence, weigh alternatives, and form his own conclusion. For the first time, Weber experienced the empowering intersection of knowledge and autonomy, realizing that reasoning could supplant indoctrination and that individual judgment mattered in shaping a society. Beyond classrooms, the presence of newspapers and periodicals offered prisoners continual access to debates and opinions that ran counter to everything they had been taught. They read critiques of President Roosevelt's policies, arguments over military strategy, and analysis of domestic and global issues that underscored the value of open discussion and intellectual plurality. To men accustomed to a media apparatus designed solely to propagate state ideology, the very concept of a free press was revelatory, demonstrating that a society could survive, even thrive, while tolerating disagreement and scrutiny. The contrast with the rigid, censorious structure of Nazi Germany could not have been starker, highlighting that transparency, debate, and dissent were not weaknesses but sources of resilience. The educational journey extended into personal reflection facilitated by chaplain-led discussions. These sessions encouraged prisoners to confront the moral consequences of their service, to grapple with complicity, and to envision pathways toward redemption and ethical reintegration. Soldiers were not treated as mere vessels of enemy ideology. They were regarded as individuals capable of moral and intellectual growth. The curriculum of the camps thus became an extraordinary laboratory of human development, where the values of democracy, human dignity, and moral responsibility were not preached dogmatically but experienced, analyzed, and internalized through practice and reflection. Over time, the combination of formal education, engagement with free press, and guided moral discussion reshaped prisoners' understanding of the world and their place within it. They learned to recognize the power of knowledge, the necessity of critical inquiry, and the moral obligations that accompany freedom and agency. These lessons, rooted in everyday interactions and reinforced by structured programs, provided the foundation for a profound transformation, illustrating that captivity could also be a conduit for intellectual and ethical liberation. The German POWs, initially awed by abundance and challenged by cultural dissonance, now began to appreciate the deeper principles that governed a society capable of combining liberty with order, questioning with responsibility, and freedom with morality, equipping them with insights that would endure long after their release and forever shape their understanding of human potential and social organization. By mid-1944, the education and exposure that had slowly begun to transform the German prisoners' perspectives were about to confront them with a truth far more harrowing than any lesson in civility. Democracy, or ethical reasoning, could prepare them for the carefully managed environment of the camps, which had introduced them to fairness, dignity, and critical thinking, could not shield them from the stark, undeniable reality of the regime they had served. On a crisp morning, prisoners across facilities from Mississippi to Kansas were brought together for screenings that would leave an indelible mark on every viewer. Documentary footage of the liberated concentration camps, images of a horror so vast and systematic that it defied comprehension and shook even the most hardened men to their core. The initial silence in the theaters was profound, as men struggled to reconcile the atrocities displayed before them with the pride and loyalty they had been taught to feel toward the Reich. The prisoners, many of whom had believed in the Nazi narrative that these sites were merely work facilities or exaggerated propaganda, were forced to confront irrefutable evidence of mass murder and systematic cruelty, scenes of emaciated survivors, piles of the dead, and the remnants of machinery designed for industrial-scale extermination shattered illusions and elicited reactions that ranged from stunned disbelief to outright grief. For men like Vera Hoffman, who had been steeped in ideology since childhood, the experience was more than shocking. It was a moral earthquake that undermined the very foundation of their worldview. Hoffman described the silence that fell over the audience as deafening, a moment in which the weight of complicity and the scale of human suffering converged in a visceral, inescapable reality. The initial impact was raw and overwhelming. Grown men wept openly, some unable to reconcile the horrors before them with the notions of duty and honor that had guided their service. Others sat in stunned reflection, questioning the decisions, actions, and indoctrination that had led them to participate in, or at least passively witness, a system capable of such monstrous crimes. The experience was a form of moral confrontation unlike any they had encountered in their lives. It was a confrontation not imposed through authority or punishment, but through evidence, empathy, and the undeniable testimony of reality itself. The psychological weight of seeing the consequences of their nation's ideology firsthand forced an internal reckoning, compelling prisoners to consider their own responsibility, their potential complicity, and the ethical failures of obedience without conscience. Yet the American authorities, rather than exploiting this moment as a tool of humiliation or retribution, recognize an opportunity for profound moral and intellectual education. The screenings became the catalyst for what camp administrators called the Great Awakening, a deliberate program designed to guide prisoners through reflection, discussion, and ethical reconstruction. Small group discussions, led by chaplains, educators, and specially trained personnel, provided a safe space for prisoners to articulate their shock, explore their grief, and confront the dissonance between what they had been taught and the reality they had witnessed. These sessions emphasized personal responsibility, the inherent dignity of human life, and the potential for moral growth, focusing not on condemnation but on understanding, accountability, and the possibility of transformation. For many prisoners, this structured reflection became the framework for reconstructing a moral compass that had been distorted by years of authoritarian indoctrination. The discussions encouraged men to grapple with the tension between obedience and conscience, illustrating how personal choice could align with principles of justice and humanity rather than blind adherence to ideology. Through dialogue, prisoners began to understand the difference between following orders and ethical action, recognizing that the moral collapse of the Third Reich had been facilitated not only by those in positions of power, but also by ordinary men who had surrendered critical judgment to authority. The combination of visual evidence, intellectual guidance, and moral discourse allowed prisoners to integrate lessons about responsibility, empathy, and human rights into a coherent worldview that contrasted sharply with the rigid doctrines of their homeland. The process of moral reconstruction was further reinforced by complementary educational initiatives within the camps. English classes, access to newspapers and magazines, and informal debates provided prisoners with the tools to contextualize their experiences and challenge prior assumptions critically. By combining first-hand exposure to atrocities with the resources to examine governance, human behavior, and ethical philosophy, the prisoners were offered a comprehensive approach to understanding both the societal collapse they had served and the principles necessary to prevent its recurrence. The integration of moral reflection with cognitive engagement ensured that the lessons of the concentration camps were not abstract horrors but living catalysts for ethical and intellectual growth. In addition to structured discussions, the camps fostered personal responsibility through practical activities and social interactions. Assignments in farms, factories, and service roles required prisoners to exercise judgment, collaboration, and conscientious labor, reinforcing the moral lessons emerging from the screenings and dialogues. These experiences demonstrated that ethical action was not limited to abstract debate, but could be embodied in everyday decisions, from the treatment of others to the quality and integrity of one's work. The prisoners learned that dignity, respect, and fairness were not merely ideals to be admired from afar but principles to be enacted and observed in daily life, shaping both individual character and collective cohesion. Over time, the combined effect of confronting the Holocaust's realities and engaging with structured reflection fundamentally altered the prisoners' understanding of morality, responsibility, and human dignity. The experience highlighted the destructive potential of blind obedience and ideological indoctrination, while simultaneously modeling a society in which ethical principles, accountability, and personal conscience could coexist with social order and collective progress. For many men, the moral awakening initiated by these screenings became a foundation upon which they would rebuild their lives, influence their communities, and contribute to the postwar reconstruction of Germany with an understanding of human rights, democratic principles, and ethical responsibility that they had never previously known. The experience was a painful yet transformative journey, demonstrating that even in captivity, exposure to truth, reflection, and guidance could forge a path toward moral clarity, empathy, and enduring personal growth. As the war in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, The German prisoners of war in America found themselves at a crossroads between their past identities as soldiers of the Third Reich and the uncertain futures awaiting them in a shattered homeland. The world they had returned to was one of rubble-strewn streets, displaced families, and communities grappling with the aftermath of unprecedented destruction. Yet, unlike many of their countrymen, these men carried with them lessons learned not on the battlefield, but in captivity, lessons that would shape the moral, social, and political fabric of post-war Germany in ways both subtle and profound. The American experience, initially met with skepticism and disbelief, had transformed their understanding of human dignity, civic responsibility, and democratic governance, providing a foundation upon which a free society could be rebuilt. The repatriation process began methodically, with careful consideration for those prisoners who might face danger or persecution upon returning to territories under Soviet control or in regions still reeling from war. American authorities provided documentation of participation in educational programs and moral instruction, ensuring that these men could reintegrate safely and, in many cases, take on roles that would allow them to positively influence their communities. For those returning to West Germany, the lessons of the camps became a tool for reconstruction not just of cities, but of mindsets hardened by years of authoritarian indoctrination. Many former prisoners assumed roles as teachers, civil servants, or community leaders, applying the principles of critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and participatory governance they had learned in captivity to nurture democratic values in a society desperate for renewal. The impact on education was immediate and tangible. Former POWs like Henrik Weber, who had encountered American-style classrooms and engaged in debates about democracy and individual responsibility, sought to replicate these methods in their own schools. His classrooms became microcosms of the democratic experiment he had observed in America, emphasizing discussion, reasoning, and the ability to question authority rather than rote memorization and unquestioning obedience. Students were encouraged to voice opinions, challenge assumptions, and consider multiple perspective skills that had been cultivated painstakingly during years in the camps. Over time, this approach helped instill a culture of critical engagement in a generation growing up amid the ruins of war, planting seeds for a more resilient and informed citizenry. Beyond education, former POWs contributed to governance and civic life in Germany, drawing upon their understanding of participatory institutions and social responsibility, exposure to fair labor practices, ethical leadership, and the balance between individual rights and collective obligations in America provided a template for public service rooted in integrity and accountability. Local governments and civic organizations benefited from the insights these men had acquired, as they promoted transparency, fairness, and ethical decision-making in rebuilding public institutions. By modeling respect, dialogue, and civic engagement, repatriated prisoners helped counter the authoritarian tendencies that had previously dominated German society, demonstrating that a nation could be both strong and just. The social influence of former POWs extended to the communities in which they settled. They carried with them an appreciation for egalitarian principles, the dignity of labor, and the importance of empathy and mutual respect, values they had observed firsthand while working on farms, in factories, and in service roles in America. These experiences shaped not only their personal interactions, but also their broader engagement with society, fostering a culture of cooperation, tolerance, and ethical participation. Their ability to bridge ideological divides, having witnessed the humanity of those they were once taught to see as enemies, contributed to a gradual process of reconciliation and rebuilding within a fractured nation. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this transformation was the moral and psychological growth of the prisoners themselves. Captivity, initially a source of fear and uncertainty, had become a crucible for intellectual, ethical, and emotional development. Confronted with evidence of the atrocities committed by the regime they had served, guided through reflection, and exposed to a society built on fairness and respect, these men emerged with a renewed understanding of conscience, responsibility, and human dignity. The principles they internalized: respect for individual rights, commitment to ethical leadership, and belief in the power of education and discourse enabled them not only to adapt to postwar society, but also to contribute meaningfully to its reconstruction. Over the following decades, the ripple effects of this unlikely experiment became evident. Former POWs who embraced these lessons influenced trade, governance, education, and civil society, helping to lay the foundation for a democratic West Germany that would flourish politically, socially, and economically. Their experiences demonstrated the potential for transformation even in the most unlikely circumstances, showing that exposure to ethical principles, critical thought, and humane treatment could break cycles of indoctrination and cultivate the values necessary for a free society. Captivity, once a symbol of defeat, had become a vehicle for empowerment, moral reflection, and enduring contribution to the common good. As we reflect on this remarkable story, it becomes clear that the legacy of those American POW camps extends far beyond the immediate context of World War II. They illustrate the power of education, empathy, and ethical engagement in shaping not just individuals, but societies. By treating prisoners with dignity, providing opportunities for intellectual and moral growth, and modeling democratic principles in action, the United States demonstrated that the true strength of a society lies not merely in its military might, but in its commitment to human values and the transformative potential of compassion and knowledge. Thank you for watching this exploration of a truly remarkable chapter in history. If you found this story inspiring and thought-provoking, please hit the like button, share it with others who appreciate history and human resilience, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into stories that changed the world. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible tales to life, highlighting the lessons we can all carry forward from the past. Every click, every view, every subscription helps keep history alive, and together, we can learn from the past to build a better, more informed future.